Okay, let's start. So before we start reading and commenting, just an overview of what we've been discussing. And I thought this could be a good way to enter into our overview. So now that we're in the season of Lent, we're coming closer to Easter, and Easter is always a season of baptism, right? Catechumens are baptized in Easter, but in Easter is also an opportunity where we renew our baptismal vows. And there's something about baptism in itself that has to do with death and resurrection, with death to your old being and being renewed to a new life, death to your old condition and being born to a new life with Christ. And in fact, everything about baptism speaks about this. When you are immersed in the water, that's the way that people used to be baptized. They were fully immersed in the water. Like what's happening is that you're dying to your old being, and when you come out from the water, you come out as a new self, right? So why am I talking about this movement of baptism? Because what we've been talking about through the school year is we're talking about the process of dying to sin and dying to self. Really, everything that we've been discussing has to do with dying to sin. We've been talking about the negative aspects of the Christian life, and this is a way that we can express it. Like we're in this continual battle against sin, because, I mean, it's true. We could say, oh, but the day that we were baptized, we died to sin, and it's true, but the process of death against sin is a process that goes on through our whole life, in the same way that the process of enjoying the resurrected life and the new life is also something that happens throughout our whole life. So in discussing our struggle and our battle against sin, that's our major enemy in our spiritual life, we talked about mortal sin, we talked about venial sin, and we talked about imperfections, right? But we said sin is our main enemy, but we also said there are three other enemies that we fight against that are not sin in itself, but are ways in which sin wants to reach our life. And those three enemies are world, Satan, or temptation, or the devil, and flesh. So we spoke about the world a while ago, and when we spoke about temptation, we had three talks. We talked about the psychology of temptation. We talked about how is it that we should act against temptation before, during, and after. And the last time we spoke about something interesting. We spoke about demonic obsession. That's another form of temptation. But today we're going to talk about the flesh. The flesh is one of our enemies of the soul. One of the enemies that is conducive towards sin. Because we're in the whole process of seeing, like, how is it that we as Christians should consistently keep ourselves in our struggle and in our battle against sin. So that's what we're going to read today about the flesh as one of our enemies. So in the hope that this recording will help, instead of having you read, because the recording won't help hear you read, I'm going to read. So bear with me. It says, struggle against the flesh. The world and the devil are our main external enemies. So what's common to the two of these is that they are external to ourselves. They are not within us. Yet we carry within ourselves an enemy far more dangerous than both our own flesh. So the flesh is an enemy that's internal. We don't find it outside, but we find it within of who we are. The world can be resisted by despising its vanities, and the devil cannot withstand the supernatural power of grace. But the flesh wages an unceasing war against us, and it is extremely difficult to protect ourselves fully from its demands. Our flesh attacks us in two principal ways. So we're going to have two talks on the flesh. We're going to divide it on two talks. One talk has to do with the fact that the flesh has an immoderate desire for pleasure. So it has a pursuit of pleasure that's beyond our control, or can be beyond our control. But the flesh also has an instinctive horror to suffering. Oh, the other way around. So if we had to sum the talk, like, in what way is the flesh our enemy? And we would sum it in this way. The flesh is our enemy for spiritual growth, because the flesh keeps us, like, our flesh always wants to enjoy and have more pleasure, and it has an instinctive horror to suffering. And that is a great obstacle to our spiritual growth. How so? It says, the first, it's talking about its instinctive horror for suffering, is a major obstacle to holiness, since sanctification requires self-denial and generosity and sacrifice. The second, the insatiable desire for pleasure, can even endanger eternal salvation. For this reason, it is essential to understand these tendencies and learn how to resist them. Okay, so today we're going to talk about the desire for pleasure. Like, how is it a problem that our flesh always wants to enjoy more? Why is this problematic for spiritual growth? And one of the ways that we talk technically about the desire for pleasure is concupiscence. So here we go. It says, the craving for pleasure is the characteristic inclination of sensuality. We avoid suffering because we love pleasure. And that's true. We all love pleasure. Who doesn't like pleasure? Who doesn't enjoy cookies and sparkling water and sitting comfortably and watching something that's beautiful? Like, pleasure is something that we want, and we want it in the greatest measure that we can take it. Follow the inclination. This inclination is traditionally called concupiscence. Following Aristotle, St. Thomas Aquinas defined concupiscence as the appetite for pleasure. It resides primarily in the sensitive appetite, though it involves the whole person because of the union between body and soul. Okay. Pleasure itself, even bodily pleasure, is not evil. God placed it in certain natural activities, especially those related to the preservation of the individual and of the human race, to encourage them. So think about this. What are the three most pleasurable things that we enjoy as human beings? Like, what are the three things that we are drawn to the most? And those are sexual pleasure, eating, and sleeping. Those are the three most, enticing things that human beings encounter. Perhaps the sexual pleasure is the most intense of the three of them, but all three things are extremely compelling. Now think about this. Why are those things so compelling? God has made those things compelling because all of them are necessary for the preservation of the species. Why is sexual pleasure compelling? Because we need it for the preservation of the species. Right? So we're drawn to procreate in a sense. Why is eating so pleasurable? Oh, because we need to eat to sustain our bodies. And why is sleeping so pleasurable? Because we need it also for the recomposition of whatever. I'm not a scientist, but you know what I mean. So look at this. Like, the three most desirable things, God has made them pleasurable because they have to do with the preservation of the species. So in themselves, the fact that they're pleasurable, there's nothing wrong with that. So it says, however, after original sin, the harmony between reason and the lower appetites was disrupted. So what does that mean? In every human being, we have an intelligence, but we also have lower appetites, right? And ideally, we should pursue sexual pleasure or eating or sleeping ordered by reason, right? We should engage with sexual pleasure as long as it's for procreative reasons and for unitive reasons within the bounds of marriage. But how many times do we pursue sexual pleasure not guided by our reason, but guided by our appetites? So that conflict between reason and the appetites is a result of original sin. Like, we're divided within ourselves, right? We're divided. We're fighting against ourselves. Think about eating. Eating is good and eating is pleasurable. And how many times we should eat according to reason? Like, let's eat according, whatever you need. And how many times you eat beyond what we need? Because our appetites, instead of being subjected to a reason, govern our reason, right? And the same thing for sleep. Like, we should have a reasonable time of sleeping. But nowadays, we sleep less than we would need because we are up doing stupid things. Or sometimes we sleep too much. And it could go either way. But it says, as a result, the desire for pleasure often rebels against reason and can lead a person towards sin. So sin happens when your appetites govern over your reason. So the thing you choose the pleasurable things not according to reason, but according to your lower desires. St. Paul describes vividly this inner conflict between flesh and the spirit. The difficulty lies in determining the boundary between legitimate pleasure and disordered pleasure and remaining within proper limits. Even lawful pleasures can easily lead to unlawful ones. Like, is it unlawful to have a drink? No, it's fine to have a drink. It's fine to have a beer. But the lawful pleasures can lead us to unlawful pleasures very easily. That's why it's important that we determine the right boundaries. For this reason, Christian tradition recommends moderation and even voluntary renunciation of some legitimate pleasures, not because they're sinful, but to safeguard virtue. So the other day, I was reminded about this. St. Ignatius of Loyola, in the spiritual exercises, he says that penance should be done for 3 different reasons. He says penance is good to be done, first, to repair for our own sins. Second, penance is good to practice it because it unites us with the sufferings of Christ. But he says the third reason why penance is good to practice is because it subjects your appetite to your reason. Like it subjects it to the reason. Because what happens is the more you live according to your appetites, the more your appetites grow in strength and the less of a voice your reason has. So like they're in a permanent battle. So really what you want to do is you want to exercise yourself in such a way that your appetites are subject to reason. So what the author is saying is, let's read again. For this reason, Christian tradition recommends moderation and even voluntary renunciation of some legitimate pleasures. For example, a lot of people in Lent, they say, I'm going to abstain from drinking alcohol. Is alcohol in itself unlawful? No. But what happens is you give up something that's lawful so that you can stay further away from the unlawful. Does that make sense? It's like you abstain from what could be lawful so that you stay further away from what is unlawful. Experience shows that satisfying one sense can stimulate others, since pleasure affects the whole body. The typical example that people offer is the example of lust and eating. They say that the more you indulge in eating, the more you are inclined also to consent in the sense of lust. This is by no means always the case, of course not. But what the author is saying is, when you satisfy one sense, you can stimulate others, since pleasure affects the whole body. Although the body has many instincts, the principal struggle concerns 2 fundamental drives, nourishment and reproduction. These ones here. These are necessary for human life, yet concupiscence seeks only the pleasure associated with them rather than their rightful purpose. Without the guidance of reason, these desires can lead to serious moral disorder. Gluttony and lust, frequently linked in scripture and experience, often reinforce one another. That's why fasting, for example, is a good practice against lust. When sensual appetites are not disciplined, they can seriously harm both spiritual growth and salvation. Now that's the point that the author is going to try to drive in today. He's saying, the problem with our immoderate desire for pleasure is that sometimes it can risk our own salvation because we can indulge in mortal sin in our pursuit of those pleasures. Like getting drunk or eating too much or any form of lust. Like that's the problem with the flesh. That it's such a powerful force that it can endanger our salvation. This makes me think about something that St. Teresa of Avila used to say. She said something very insightful. You know what she said? She said, the more you indulge to your flesh, the more your flesh will ask of you. It's like a monster, right? That the more you feed it, the more it wants of you. But she also says the inverse statement. She says, it's incredible how little you can indulge with, like how little you can give your flesh and how your flesh can take very little. This same author, I remember he says this. He says, much more diseases come from an excess of eating that come from what's the opposite of excess? That from a defect of eating. Circling back to Teresa of Avila, right? She said, the more you indulge with your flesh, the more your flesh asks of you. The less you give your flesh, the less your flesh asks of you. A person dominated by sensuality gradually loses the sense of divine realities and becomes absorbed in bodily pleasures. So what the author is saying is, the more you let your appetites dominate you, the less you can consider with your reason about your eternal salvation. It's like, in a sense, your intelligence and your capacity to perceive spiritual things is frustrated or like affected by how much you indulge in your appetites. And this is true because the opposite is true. The less you attend to your appetites, the more your reason can also perceive the truth of spiritual realities. Such a life is incompatible with the Christian ideal, which raises a human person toward union with God. Okay, remedies against concupiscence. This struggle against sensuality lasts throughout life and is especially intense at the beginning of the spiritual journey. That's it. It's especially intense for all of us because we're all beginners in our spiritual journey. Both natural and supernatural remedies are necessary. Among natural means are practicing self-denial, even in lawful things. One should avoid approaching the limits of what is permitted, since relying on one's ability to stop at the right moment is dangerous. So, a question that I want to ask you, like, this Lent, have you chosen to deny yourself in things that could be lawful? Like I said, is drinking a beer unlawful? No, but it's good to defeat our flesh, to be able to give up on lawful things. So, I don't know. Or let me rephrase the question. How consistent are you in giving up lawful things? Like, how often are you willing to say, there's nothing wrong with this, but I'm going to choose not to do it for my own spiritual growth? Then it says, accepting suffering on the cross. Patiently enduring hardship weakens the power of sensuality and strengthens the will. Rachel spoke about learning that the other teacher wasn't going to be there, right? And she had to endure going throughout the day without a rest. Accepting that suffering on the cross, like that's a way that we can strengthen the will. Avoiding idleness. This comes over and over again. Not being idle. An occupied mind and disciplined life reduces the influence of passions. Intellectual work in particular helps restrain sensual desires. And I want to make a little comment here. Something that I've been thinking about that I shared with you is like, what would our life look like if we pushed ourselves to like a place where I'm giving all the time for God and for others and really saving for myself as little as possible? And I think that's a great ideal, something that I'm trying to do. Like how far can I push myself in really making my life about God and others and much less about myself? And the crazy thing is that I think the more generous we are in staying busy, having less time for ourselves, I think the more joy we find. And I know it's true, there's a legitimate claim for self-care. I'm not disputing that. But I think that the less idle we are and the more active we can stay in being of service for others, I think there's something beautiful about living that way. It says, fleeing dangerous occasions, even strong resolutions can fail when a person exposes himself imprudently to temptation, especially through the senses, particularly sight. So this is a great reminder for each one of us. Like, one of the senses that we really have to mortify and we have to guard is the sense of sight. Especially us men, that we tend to be so visual. Like, we have to be mindful of, refraining from looking on our cell phones, on the street. When I drive here from my house, I always drive like through a main avenue where the UST students are there, right? But in the winter, it's like there's never any woman, like there's no one to look at. But in the summer, it's like they're like bacteria that, where there's sun. I don't know where all the ladies come from. But nobody's walking in the street, I promise. But anyways. Then it says, I'm going to edit that from the top. It says, more powerful remedies come from faith. Reflecting on the dignity of the Christian. Through grace, the believer becomes a child of God and a temple of the Holy Spirit. Such dignity should inspire resistance to degrading passions. So just thinking about who we are by baptism, what is it that we, like, the fact that we're sons and daughters of God, like, living out that dignity, embracing that dignity, rejoicing in that dignity, and living according to that dignity. Considering the consequences of sin, remembering divine judgment and the suffering caused by sin can strengthen the will. That's why we spoke about mortal sin and venial sin and the consequences of them. Because just reminding ourselves of the consequences of sin should be a good way in which we keep our appetite subject to our reason. Meditating on Christ's passion. Love and gratitude toward Christ, who suffered for humanity, encourage the rejection of sin. Humble and persevere in prayer. Victory over concupiscence is impossible without God's grace. Devotion to the Virgin Mary. Frequent reception of the sacraments. So, let me just finish the talk with this question because, I've said this many times. When we come to the meeting, this is not so much a class as it is hopefully a chance where we can look at ourselves, look at our own soul, look at how we're doing, listen to where God is calling us to grow. So, how much of an enemy is your flesh for you right now? And is it true for you that the immoderate desire for pleasure is risking your own salvation? Are you sometimes acting against your reason, moved by your appetites just to satisfy what your flesh is asking of you, even when you're endangering the salvation of your soul? And then we could ask, how much of the means that are offered in this talk have you been putting into practice? Is it true what we've read? Like, are you abstaining from lawful things so you keep further away from the unlawful? Are you staying busy, like, as much as you can so that you can be of service to others? Not, like, subjecting to your flesh and its requirements to find pleasure for yourself? Are we staying away from the occasion of sin? Are we turning frequently to God and to His grace through prayer? Glory to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end.